Right, so the Marxist theory of the state, I want to start by saying really that the state and our approach to it is really a fundamental question for socialists and for other people who sort of seek to change the society that we live in. And how you sort of approach and answer the question of the state is one of the sort of fundamental dividing lines between us in the SWP as revolutionary socialists and reformists. By that I mean people who call themselves socialists but think that you can change the system from within to get to socialism, and also between us as revolutionary socialists and people who would call themselves anarchists or autonomists even. And when we look at the state, really, a number of important questions arise that how you answer them impacts on your strategy for today. Questions like, can we take over the state? How do we challenge the state? What would happen if we got rid of the state? Lead on to key points about whether we're talking about socialism from above or socialism from below. Where does power actually lie under capitalism? And what sort of society are we fighting for ultimately? And we can see these questions being posed throughout history and also today, and different responses to them. And you can see it both in the sort of big struggles, like the sort of ongoing revolution in Egypt and such, and also in the smaller struggles like local strikes, fights against cuts and stuff. And I want to try and look at some of those questions and we can talk about them hopefully in the discussion afterwards. But I should point out really at this point that I'm not just sort of making this up as my own theory. This is, the question of the state was an absolutely key question for Marx and Engels and was brought together and built on by Lenin, particularly in this fantastic book, State and Revolution, which everyone should read if they haven't already. So that's sort of my, what I'm basing what I'm saying on really. But the first question really, before we sort of get onto that, is what do we actually mean by the state? Often when people that have been involved in sort of different political things, the most common way that we use the word is often to do with the welfare state, which is something good, it's something that we defend, and maybe we can talk about how that fits into what I'm talking about. But what I'm going to mostly mean when I'm talking about the state here today in this meeting is the bits of the state that make up sort of forms of authority, the bits that rule over us. Marx used the phrase special bodies of armed men, which obviously covers the army and the police, but also the sort of people and institutions, the judiciary, the prisons that back up those things, help to enforce the laws, and the people that sort of make and uphold the laws themselves, the sort of whole body of unelected people with power behind the scenes in Whitehall, civil servants and government officials. So that's sort of what I mean when I'm going to be talking about the state here today. But what we really need to get onto is why is the state, why is it there? And the answer is that the state is not an eternal institution. It's not always been there, but it's the product of the division of society into separate classes and the irreconcilability of class antagonisms that brought about. And what I mean by that is because capitalism is built on exploitation, by which I mean that there's a tiny minority of people who own and control all the means of production, the ability to make a living, and they rely on the vast majority of people to make their profits, to go to work and make profit for them. And it's that profit or the accumulation of wealth that drives the system forward. But in order to make bigger and bigger profits, they have to attack the people that work for them. They have to try and make us work longer or for less pay, and we're not necessarily going to give in to that. So there's a struggle that goes on. How do the ruling class keep control throughout that? And really that's what the state is all about. Its function is for one class to dominate over another. And this isn't just the case under capitalism, that's what I've described as a capitalist system, but all class societies up to now have been about the minority imposing their will on the majority. So in feudalism, you had lords and serfs, slave owners and slaves, and today in capitalism, the ruling class over workers. But what Friedrich Engels, who was Marx's sort of lifelong collaborator, in his important book, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, looked at how the state developed alongside private property and class society. It's also where he locates the origins of women's oppression, but that's sort of a whole other discussion really. But what he sees, he describes is how as agriculture develops and people are able to produce more than they need for just their own basic subsistence, it allows some people to build up a surplus of things, and class society develops, there's inequality. And it's alongside this that the first state sort of comes into existence. And so the development of class society and the state is absolutely linked together. And the state is there to maintain that order, the domination of one class by another. But it doesn't do so explicitly. You know, if you apply for a job at Whitehall or you're in the police force or whatever, in the job description it doesn't say, you know, task 1, you must maintain the domination of capitalists over workers. The state pretends to be neutral. You know, judges and police and all the different bits of the state are supposed to be independent and are actually supposed to be there for our own good. And that's one of the ways that they hide class rule, is by saying that it represents the nation, actually. That it's not the ruling class's interests that the state is protecting, but the interests of everyone who, you know, happens to live on the same place, be born on, you know, the same bit of land or whatever. Laws are made for the national interests, and the police are there to enforce the law of the land. But you don't have to look too deeply, really, to see that it's not neutral at all. You only have to look at, you know, the direct links between the people who are at the top of the state. It's the same families at the top of businesses and boardrooms, and also at the top of the army, the police, and, you know, they have all their own schools that they go to separate from ours, their own clubs, all the rest of it, really. They're a separate and linked class of people. So the whole purpose of the state is kept obscured from ordinary people, but sometimes that cover does get blown. So it can be in a big way, like, you know, you see in Syria at the moment, where the full force of the state is getting waged against its own people. But also, you know, the sort of fact that the state's not neutral can be exposed to us, you know, all the time. You go to a demonstration and a policeman hits you over the head. He's not neutral in doing that. And I think one of the best examples that's been explained to me, really, that exposes which side, and the fact that the state isn't neutral, but which side they actually really are on, is if you look at work, or the loss of work, and if a group of workers goes on strike against job losses or against whatever, really, the police will come in and to try and break the strike, get the scabs into work because they have a right to work, and there's all sorts of laws and everything behind it to make it easier for them to do that. But if a workplace is shutting down and the workers decide to try and occupy their workplace to stop it being shut down, the police are brought in to chuck the workers out. And there's, you know, workers have had to fight lots and lots of battles to get any protection at all from just being able to be sacked at will by the bosses. But it's not just enough to expose the role that the state plays. In every struggle, in every time that there is even a challenge to the state, people still have illusions that they can make it good. If you just change the personnel at the top or introduce some different laws, you know, that they can wield it for their own use. And this partly, you know, reflects how deep this idea is in our society, and that, you know, are taught everything is about looking to people above us to change things for us, to do things for us. But even in somewhere like Egypt, where after decades of dictatorship and, you know, torture at the hands of the state, having started a process of revolution, face massive repression from their own state for doing that, when they finally get rid of Mubarak, there's still an argument about whether they have to get rid of the whole system. They think if they just elect someone else, then it will be better for themselves. So if the state is an instrument for dominating, as I've outlined there, what I want to say is that it can't just be turned around in that way. It can't be used to create a different society just because you've got different people in or whatever. I want to go through some of the reasons why for that, really. Firstly, because the whole thing of it is absolutely, completely rotten. It's filled with rotten ideas. You have to look at, you know, racism in the police. Even after, you know, the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, where supposedly, you know, supposed to have reformed themselves or whatever, more and more reports come out of these incidents, and it's not just isolated incidents or, you know, individuals within it. Someone describes it as me as with the police. It's not a bad apple spoiling the barrel, but a bad barrel that spoils the apples. Because really the whole police force reflects the very worst ideas about ordinary people in our society, that we are all, you know, selfish and greedy and would, you know, be attacking each other, you know, if it wasn't for them there to keep law and order. And that's, you know, the ideological basis for it, really. And, you know, the rottenness extends to the other parts, the judiciary, the army. They're like that, you know, for a reason, really, because they are there to reproduce and prove, really, the ideas that keep the ruling class in power. And if you think about the hierarchical nature of the state, it's like that in order to, you know, maintain a hierarchy in a workplace. We're used to being ruled over. We have rulers and ruled, bosses and workers. It's the natural order of things, as we're told. But secondly, it's not just about the ideas, but actually it's about the reality of when the state exists. The modern state is a capitalist state. It's developed in order to maintain and prop up and expand capitalism. So just like the rest of the system, it is in itself driven by capitalist competition, which exists between capitalists, but also to some extent, governments and states have to play that game as well. And this is why we see many times people elect someone left-wing or with progressive aims into a government, but they're corrupted by the position that they find themselves in. Once in government, really, they're forced to serve capitalism and not the people that elected them there. And finally, a reason really that I want to point out about why I think you can't just take over the existing state is that although it's there to maintain class rule, it's not actually where a lot of power in society lies at all, because under capitalism there's a divide, isn't there, between the political and the economic. And even in our supposedly democratic society, many decisions that have absolutely massive impact on our lives have nothing to do with the politicians that we elect at all. They happen in the boardrooms and in the banks, what to produce, who to employ where, to shut down and open up workplaces, what services to run. These decisions are not taken by people that we elect. So as revolutionary socialists, really, we say that you can't take over the state, but actually we have to smash it and completely dismantle it. But what does that mean? And I'm not talking about, the SWP taking out arms and going and storming Parliament tomorrow. And I'm not, unfortunately, but I'm not even talking about picking a fight directly with, aspects of the state, like we're going to go and fight the police today, or we're going to go and fight the judges and the courts because they're, doing the wrong thing or whatever. It has to be smashed by a workers' revolution. And we're talking about smashing the state in the context of mass revolutionary upheaval and ordinary people doing it for themselves. A key fundamental point that Marx makes is that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class. And this is what was happening, actually, literally, when Lenin was writing the book State and Revolution. It's got quite a sudden ending. He starts the last chapter and then says, actually, I'm not going to bother finishing this because there's a revolution going on outside, and why am I sat here writing about it when I could be taking part in it? But what had happened really was in February 1917, revolution had erupted in Russia. There's mass strikes which spread, involving literally hundreds of thousands of workers across the whole country. And the state had tried to repress them. They'd brought the army in to try and get the people back to work. But the army, in quite large numbers, had refused. And large numbers had gone onto the side of the workers. The Tsar fell, and millions of people had actually been involved in that process. But the old order still existed. To some extent. There was a provisional government who had no real intention of challenging the power of the capitalists and creating sort of real social change. But at the same time, during the revolution, bodies that had initially been set up to run the strikes, which were called Soviets, or what the Russian word for councils, had spread across the entire country. And these were sort of bodies of workers elected to represent and they were effectively running lots of the workplaces already in different towns and stuff around, already running them independently of the government. So what you actually had was a situation already of dual power between the Soviets and the provisional government. So by the time of the October Revolution, when the workers actually seized complete power for themselves, there already existed an alternative way of organising society that had grown organically out of the struggle. And this meant, for one thing, that there was hardly any bloodshed during the revolution, because power had already passed to the workers. The state was smashed through the process of building workers' power. And this is the central idea of state and revolution, that a movement aimed at overthrowing capitalism, it must remove the state from the hands of the ruling class and dismantle it and replace it. And it's not the only debate between sort of different groups of, different theories on the left. But the smashing of the state, rather than taking it over, separates us as revolutionary socialists from reformists, really. And the question of what happens next, what are we going to replace the state with, if anything, separates us from revolutionary anarchists. And it's I would say it's highly probable, and history has taught us, whenever we've seen sort of glimpses of workers almost taking power for themselves, that the ruling class will not just give up their power easily. So after a revolution, how are we going to defend the gains that we've made? We're talking about taking control of, the whole country initially, and hopefully it'll be international. It would have to be international ultimately, but it's not likely to all happen at once. What if the ruling class try and take those things back from us? And that's why, I would argue that we need a workers' state. We need a means, because we still need a means for one class, but this time it would be the working class, to dominate over the other. But for the first time, this would be the majority ruling over the minority. And that would look, fundamentally different, really. What would it look like? We can learn from the Bolshevik Revolution, which I talked a bit about there. But I want to go one step back and look at what Marx and Lenin themselves learnt a lot from, which was the Paris Commune. When in 1871, workers in Paris took over and ran the city of Paris for themselves. It was enormously important. Marx and Engels actually edited the Communist Manifesto in light of events that took place. And during the Paris Commune, the workers did attempt to sort of dismantle the existing state. And what they replaced it with was basically a massive extension of democracy, of real democracy. What do I mean by real democracy? Well, there was no division, like I said, between the political and economic life and decisions, no separate political class, and no unelected or unaccountable officials with power. All officials were subject to election and also instantly recallable and paid an average worker's wage. And these are principles that are repeated in many forms of workers' organisation since. But what the Paris Commune really was a glimpse of an alternative, but it also showed the force that the capitalist class would be willing to use against any challenge to it, because the Paris Commune didn't completely destroy the old state. They were able to regroup and then absolutely brutally repress the Commune about 2 months later, slaughtering lots of the people that were involved. And there's been lots of examples of sort of embryonic workers' controls throughout history since that. I'm not going to list them all, but in Spain and Chile, many different examples. And all of these have been sort of had similar ideas, but have been spontaneously thrown up by the struggle with sort of similar principles. Bodies of rule that encompass the whole class and are directly accountable to that class. Apart from the Soviets and Russia, obviously, none have actually managed to replace the capitalist state. But it's important to say that, really, because it shows that what I'm talking about isn't just something that Marx and Lenin have dreamt up, but it's something that has time and again come organically out of struggle, and revolutionaries have learnt from. So this is the type of sort of alternative that socialists envision, but it's important to say that that is still a state. We defined a state as being an instrument for one class to dominate over another, and after the revolution, we won't just move instantly to a classless society, and that's why we'll need a worker state. And as well as that, actually, as simply being a means to defend literally, the revolution. Physically defend it, then we need to think about, actually, we're going to be trying to build a completely new society, and there's all sorts of tasks that will have to be completed. If you just think about housing, for example, we probably want to do something about the fact that there are lots of homeless people, or people with inadequate housing, and there are people with far more housing than they need. I don't mean someone with a spare bedroom in their council flat, but people who've got 4 houses or whatever, we want to sort that out and divide that up. And we need to have a means for doing that. But what is important about it is that it is acting in the interest of the majority over the minority. So the working class needs a state power, centralised organisation of force, an organisation of violence, Lenin describes it as, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the enormous mass of the population in the work of organising a socialist economy. But ultimately, I want to see a society without classes, where there's not a divide in that way. And if the state is the way of one class dominating over another, then I want to see a society without a state. And what Lenin describes will happen is the withering away of the state. And it's a very important and often confusing point, really. And sometimes when people think of socialism, then they think we mean sort of nationalising everything and having everything sort of run by a government. And there probably will be some of that along the way. But it's not actually my ultimate aim or Marx's ultimate aim. And some people, like I've sort of said, think that you can go straight from capitalist society by a revolution to a society that doesn't need a state. And as I've explained before, I think we will need one, but it'll be temporary. And Lenin describes it as a transitional phase. But eventually, that state, the worker state, will wither away or die of itself. And it might sound sort of a bit wishful or vague, but what we mean by that is that the material basis for the state will disappear, and so it does too. And it's only once the way that production is organised is changed to such an extent that we both eliminate scarcity and also that people are no longer alienated in their labour. So work becomes a part of our lives, not something we do in order to have a life. Then society becomes organised from each according to his ability to each according to his need, and the need for a state would wither away. But in conclusion, what I want to finish on really is something about what this actually means for us today. Why are we talking about this? Because I think really we put before ourselves, quite an immense task if we're actually, serious revolutionaries, and it can seem, a bit impossible and maybe slightly ridiculous for a group of us here in this room to be talking about fundamentally transforming the society that we live in. But it's important to remember as part of that, I think, that class society, the state and capitalism, none of them have existed forever, and there's no likelihood that they will go on forever. And we have on our side the struggles of the past to teach us, and every struggle actually makes us stronger because we can learn the lessons from it. And we recognise the power of the state, but also recognise what we have on our side. Where does our power lie? And I think it's firstly in numbers. And we want to try and win, as many people as possible to be, organised revolutionaries. But that's not actually enough on its own. And I think we have to think about where does our power lie. We know that they've got the whole instrument of the state. How are we going to challenge that? And the sort of critical point, really, of Marx is that the working class under capitalism have an absolutely unique power. And that's the fact that workers make capitalism happen. We create all the profit, and if we stop doing that, we can completely grind the system to a halt. And that's where we are powerful, and that's where actually we have the power to take on the state. And we can see it in practice, in small examples, things like the difference between the revolutions that happened in Egypt and Tunisia and some of the other uprisings at the same time, is where organised workers took action, that they became successful. Was the entry, of the mass of Egyptian workers taking strike action that actually toppled those dictators. But the other important thing about the working class, we talk about it a lot in the SWP, you might get bored of it by the end of the day, but it is very important because it's where we are collective. It forces us, the fact that we have to go to work and work with other people forces us to organise. We can't beat the boss on our own, you can't fight for a pay rise on your own. And it's through organising collectively that the ruling class ideas are challenged. And that's really why socialists, talk about class so much, because it's not just another oppression. You have racism, sexism, homophobia, and you're oppressed because you're working class as well. But it is the key to actually changing society. And given that, it has implications for how we organise, because I think we need to be organised. I've talked a bit about how organised the ruling class is. And I think what it means is that we need a party that is rooted in the working class, that's able to shape and build struggles, but also learn from them. And so that we can place ourselves so when the time does come to smash the state, we're able to put the lessons of the past into action and fundamentally challenge it when that comes about.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that talk.
I mean, I could have a go answering the question about terrible things, I suppose, because the state's mainly an expression of the divide between classes in society, and that defines what problems it takes seriously and what it doesn't. And I mean, there was an illustration that a law lecturer in the party once gave to me, is that if you kill someone, you can argue in court that it was self-defence, that you had no choice but to kill them. You might not win because defence exists. There's no equivalent defence for theft. If you've taken someone's property, you can't argue that you needed it. You could be starving to death and take as much from a rich person. That's irrelevant. Property is an absolute. Murder and killing is not. And I mean, you know, people can give any number of examples of the appalling disinterest almost of the police and the establishment more generally in things like rape and sexual assault. And so the existing state is not really one that looks out for protecting people from terrible things, as it were. A lot of the time it neglects them and prioritises you know, property and order and things like that. But also to sort of get back to to sort of elaborate on the concept of the withering away of the state as well. We only imagine a state not existing when there isn't a class divide anymore. When there are no classes, then there can't be an instrument of class rule anymore by definition. And in a society where the workers have power, the same people who produce the wealth in society get to use it and control it, then there isn't that class divide, and there isn't a need for a state of that kind. But also there will probably be, to put it bluntly, a lot fewer murderers and gangsters and rapists and things, because you will be much less likely to have the kind of mental health problems, deprivation, alienation and embitterment that capitalism produces in people. It's not to say there would be none, but actually I think there'd be a lot less of those sorts of things anyway. And what level of enforcement you need to have to respond to that, I think could be something that would be very different to the police force that we see today, the court system we see today, much less separate from ordinary people and much more, you know, you can talk about neighbourhoods organise their own committees to account for these things possibly. I think it's hard to say exactly what it would look like, but it would be a world apart from, you know, a body of armed men, as Marx described it, that's supposed to come down from above and bash people's heads into the church, which is what the state looks like today, which doesn't protect people.
So it's just like smaller bodies that would work at the more sort of local level, or no organisation.
I suppose I'm saying less separate from the people. Like, most police officers are not from the working class, but those that are, if you are a working class person who joins the police, you will not be sent to police in your own area, you'll be sent to police somewhere else. You'll be put on a higher wage than the people that you're enforcing the law on, and you will be taught to think of them with contempt, and, you know, that separation is part of what defines the state, and it would be possible to respond to such violence and things that still existed in society without creating that separation.
Yep.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of come back with, like, I spent some time in Bolivia where there's a lot of people who have never really been, because they live in such rural areas, don't meet police officers, or like don't have a lot of contact with the state, and like people do find like other ways of justice. Like they have a lot of like small communities that have like collective votes on punishments for people, and a lot of it's called like community justice, which is not entirely free of problems, but there's definitely very different ways of thinking about this. And like, there's a lot of places I think in the world where people just don't believe that the police would ever do anything good for them, which I think there's a lot more of a recognition in society of the police as like a necessary thing. So it's not, I think it is definitely something, it's like one of our cultural ideas rather than a necessary truth.
The propaganda about the police is relentless. I think you could, and I perhaps don't really do, spend your entire life watching television, watching programmes about police solving crimes, capturing murderers, locking evil people up. And even going back to the days of Dixon and Green, it's relentless and it's insidious. But if you actually look at why we have a police force, and it's a strange question to ask, why do we have a police force? Well, we have a police force because during the 19th century, when the Chartists were organising, the ruling class were finding it very difficult to control the working class. There were riots, there were rebellions, whole cities rose up and took up arms against the state. And the ruling class found that they had to send in the army. There's a problem with sending in the army. The army are people who are recruited from the working class. And as the French government found out with the Paris Commune, at some point an army will decide not to shoot the rioters or the rebels. And the ruling class were very worried about this. The debates are there in Hansard, in what was being said in Parliament, and they decided quite clearly that they had to set up a separate force, a force that was both separate from the working class but separate from the army, which could maintain law and order, which basically meant keep people, stop people rioting, stop people wrecking machines, that kind of thing. But they also recognised that there was a need to provide a justification for these people within society so that they could be accepted as a legitimate force. And part of that was the idea that they would solve crimes. But it's never been a central part of their role. The key part of their role is always the question of maintaining order. And in times when they don't have to maintain order, obviously they have to do something. And maybe I'm a bit cynical in my approach to it, but realistically, at heart, they exist to keep us down. And it's inherent in all the police training, it's inherent in the way they treat people. It's not an accident that they kettle demonstrators, it's not an accident that they beat up miners at Aubrey. None of these things are accidental. It's a key role, part of their role. And all the propaganda, you never see propaganda about the police attacking demonstrators. You never see TV programmes about the police where they attack demonstrators. It's all lies and propaganda, to be quite honest. And I think we need to bear that in mind when we talk about the kind of ways we would have of dealing with crime in the future of socialist society. You know, we would have to invent something different, but it's perhaps beyond my imagination to invent it. Maybe the people who set up the Soviets or the workers' councils or whatever will find much better ways of dealing with that.
Could you put your hand up, mate, at the back?
Yeah, I did. You mostly covered what I was going to say, but I think I'll just throw in an anecdote, which was not long after the police had first been set up, there was a riot, and on it a police officer was killed. And so the person that stabbed him in the riot was taken to court and charged for murder. And the jury convened on it, and they came out and they said that we're going to class it as a justifiable homicide. The person was let off. There was a big celebration, and a local businessman made gold medals for the jurors. So that's an indication of the different relationship they had to the police in the 19th century, where they recognised that the police were there to stop people from using riots as a way to actually achieve political ends. And then there's been an entire process throughout the media about the way it portrays the police as just these sort of innocent bobbies on the beat that are sort of going about their daily business and trying to help cats up trees and whatever, compared to the actual experience, like if miners went on strike, they'd be attacked by the police. And then the BBC, in their representation of it, they showed miners throwing mudclods and then the police advancing, whereas actually the police advanced and the miners threw mudclods back. So this is the sort of relationship that people have with the police and the way that the media represents it as well, as them being some sort of force for good, whilst any sort of dissent against the state or against society, which gets into a ruckus with the police. The violence is always portrayed as being their violence, and the police are responding to that, and it's never portrayed as police violence in the first place. So I think that's
Anyone else have something to say? Come back.
We sort of talk about the police in this way, despite their training to work for the state and to people, a lot of them do come from sort of working class. So I wonder what you thought about if, hypothetically, we did sort of take over, would the police support the people?
So there's no more contributions yet?
In response to that question, I wouldn't say absolutely the police are never going to turn around and say that, on an individual basis, they wouldn't support it. Because you probably will have police who will turn around and say, well, yeah, they've got the right idea. But the entire process of constructing a police officer is a repeated ideological indoctrination to this idea, when it comes to how they police protests, the sort of information they're given about how people function within protests. It dates back to 19th century French aristocrats looking at the revolts that are going on and saying, well, this is just madness, you get people in a crowd and there's this weird contagion where they just go around, they lose their sanity and their rational thoughts, just go around punching people. And that's the sort of stuff that's indoctrinated with the police from the very beginning when they start signing up. So, although you might get the occasional police officer that on an individual basis might say that they disagree with it and want to quit their job, you still have to be very careful, because if you look at in Tahrir Square, when you had the sort of army foot soldiers switching sides, at the same time there's that deep sort of ideological imprinting of them being in opposition. And so once Mubarak was out, the armies then closed up ranks and started becoming an oppressive force again. So it's a very dangerous sort of mentality to sort of try and use these as allies. And I think it's something that we probably, if we did get into a socialist state in the near future, optimistically, I think we'd have to completely abolish the police force and recreate something from sort of the democratic process to find out how we actually want to do it, as opposed to trying to just incorporate the old into the new.
Yeah, sorry to be talking again. About this business of withering away the state, I always find that very difficult to understand exactly what's going to happen. But what I like to do is think of something that Engels said in, I think it was A Family of Private Property in the State, when he imagined what the first generation of people who had been brought up in a society where there was no oppression, no inequality, no exploitation would be like. And he said that these people would be almost unimaginable to us. And in the same way, we get occasionally, it's like being in a disco with the strobe light on. You get occasional glimpses of what workers' control of society looks like. Something that's flash on, and then it's off again, there's a revolution for people, and 20 years later there's another one, and it's a bit like that. We haven't even seen beyond the state of workers' control, but it's very difficult for us to imagine what it would be like for a state to wither away, and for a society to be organised without some kind of overarching organisation. But I kind of like to think of it as those, something that will be achieved by those inconceivable people who don't face oppression and exploitation.
So, ignore your point, Sally, but, and it might be a really stupid question, but the sort of dream is like workers working and maybe they get benefits their work. What happens to those people who can't work? So, disabled or sick, isn't the state sort of necessary to anything?
I suppose the idea was that, once the fight for a society where, where everybody has access to the services that they need, so like where healthcare is freely provided, where people, work in their jobs, so, if somebody's disabled, they should have, it's the kind of idea each according to their ability, each according to their needs, so, you would have, hopefully, a society where that would look completely, utterly different from the one that we live in terms of, I don't know if anyone's in the previous session about, sort of women's oppression and the role of the family and the way in how, things like, domestic work is all sort of capitalism relies on, that be taken up by women inside the family. Actually, all this stuff, for example, would hopefully have, I don't know exactly what it looked like, but centres where, you have like communal, cooking and cleaning and all those kind of things, and a part of that, I imagine, would be, making sure that everybody has what they need to survive, and whether that's with disabilities or people who are sick or people who are elderly, all these services that under this current society we're just seeing under absolute attack, and so much of is like really unwilling to think a lot of the time, but on the family having to fill the gap there in the austerity tax. You can see more and more of those just basic things that we have in society and welfare state being stripped away. We would hope to provide all that to like a much better level, because I suppose the driving force behind the new society would be to provide for people what they need and to develop humanity rather than just for all that to be crushed by the profit drive of the current system, if you know what I mean. So I think we definitely want to have society about those things.
I'm an old person, I'm just here to do the filming, but I thought I'd mention that I think that whenever there's a queue, there's always someone that polices the queue. And I think that the idea of the withering away of the state is that over time, more and more things will be supplied as a kind of like, money, for example, will wither away. We go to museums now and see lots of things that they had in the old days, and I think that one day it'll be fascinating to go to a museum and see money, and if you're lucky, you'll be able to handle it and imagine what it was like in the days when we had money. But it won't happen straight away. After the Russian Revolution, they did have communal, childcare and that, and communal eating, communal laundries. Although it was a gamble whether the clothes you got back were the ones you took in. You get back somebody else's. That's what I mean by the withering away of the state. It won't happen automatically. But there's, if only on the news they would say, instead of talking about the benefits that someone who's got 11 children who's got six rooms, instead of talking about how much they get per week, if only the news would talk about the billions of pounds that Trident gets, and the billions of pounds for war, the billions of pounds for industry that is just wrecking the planet, the billions of pounds transferred from the poor to the rich. Only they talk about that. But so I think the state will gradually wither away, and eventually people will get their own clothes back from the laundry. But the idea that we need the state to look after the poor and the sick. If you look at the Paris Commune, they looked after each other. A barricade. There was men, women, and children fighting together, but they were looking after each other. Human beings. I don't know whether it was Marx or Trotsky, or one of them said that humans are spontaneously social democratic. In other words, we're social creatures. We look after ourselves and we look after other people, and we do the two things at once.
I've got a question, it might be a bit stupid as well, but I'm just interested to know what everyone thinks on an individual basis, like what action we are advocating right now on an individual basis, kind of like each. So like...
For what purpose, sorry?
Actions
to do what?
Okay, so as in moving forward, we want to organise workers.
Uh-huh.
And I'm saying on an individual basis, what action are you advocating? I.e. like, you yourself, or like, how are people going about this? Like, what's the first stage that people are sort of encouraging now?
I think don't really know what order to do it in, so whatever. But on the question of the withering away of the state, and wouldn't the sort of old ruling class or whatever come back in and take it over again once the state had withered away? Wouldn't it all go backwards? Is that kind of what you were asking?
Not necessarily like sort of landing capitalism or whatnot. Any kind of form of power, concentrations of power in the emerging. Like for example, you talk about removing the police, but then we'll set up perhaps local. But then what's to say that with that initial consolidation of power that it wouldn't gradually increase, and we get back to where we started, where there is a lot of politics, where there is an army, where there is state apparatus working around.
I think there's sort of two parts to that really. One is that we're talking about having to have a worker state for a while before it withers away, because the ideas of our society will still be in people's heads, a lot of it. Even if we take away the reality of it, take over, workplaces and everything, and are running it for ourselves, people will still remember how things used to be. But eventually, like the comrade over there was talking about, those people, those ideas die after a while. And so that sort of side of it goes away. But I think partly when people come to that question, what they're worried about and thinking about is what happened in Russia after the Russian Revolution and the move to Stalinism. And I think in answer to that, we have to look at why that happened. Was it just that because people, are naturally power hungry, and once they get into a position of power, they'll try and hold on to it? Or was it because of something that happened in Russia specifically at that time? And I think it's the second thing. It's not just that, the people got, a taste of power and became the capitalists themselves almost. But what happened is the basis for their power, which was the working class, the best Bolsheviks went to fight in the Civil War, and most of them died. And so the working class was, the basis of their power was no longer there. And so there became a bureaucracy without basis of the power, because the revolution didn't spread to elsewhere as well. So I think that's kind of sometimes where that question comes from, really. And it's obviously, a good question, because that is what I'm pointing to as the glimpse of destroying a state, but actually that didn't, we don't have worldwide socialism today, so why did that go wrong? But on the question of sort of the police and sort of what would we do, I think if you look at things like even in Tahrir Square, and there's some good accounts of it during the Spanish Civil War, actually, where actually they talk about, women talk about how in Tahrir Square, it was for the first time they didn't have to fear being sexually assaulted in the street. They felt safe in the square because people were policing it for themselves. Actually, a lot of the problems previously were coming from the police, and so people felt, not that there was any formal thing, but people just did sort of look after each other and do all those things whilst they were there. And I think that's there's the two parts that people have already said, really. One is that, where does crime actually come from in society? And a lot of it comes from the fact that, inequality and poverty and all the rest of it. But also that why, I've forgotten the second bit I was going to say, actually, so I'll forget about that bit. On the question about would the police support the revolution? What sort of we've seen most times in history is actually that there's a difference between the police and the army, and that often the army, like we saw it in Egypt very recently, have come onto the side, and it's actually quite a necessary thing for them to come onto the side of the workers and no longer be willing to sort of prop up the capitalist rule. The police, on the other hand, I think is a bit different, because the ideology behind it is different. When you join the army, you are in some, I'm not saying this is actually what I think they're doing, but people have the notion that they're doing it for the people, that they're fighting for their own people, and you often, go and fight abroad or whatever, fighting with different people, but you have a notion that you're part of the people. When you join the police, you're there to stop bad people from doing bad things, your own people, and I think it's much harder to break from that ideologically, but I'm not saying it's not possible, and there are sort of, incidences of the police going on strike and stuff in history. But what I'll finish on really is sort of, I don't know if it will quite answer your question, about what can we actually do here today. And I think, in one way, the answer is that as individuals we can do very little. Which is, why, we're in the SWP, we're part of an organisation, so that we can do something together. And I think when we're talking about all this, some of it, all the different bits that are quite difficult to imagine really, is because the state actually does a very good job of one of its jobs, which is to sort of perpetuate the ideas that keep things as they are, to hide its true nature, and more than that, to make us think that it is the natural way of doing things. And, you know, it's not just about the things I've talked about actually, but, you know, the media, what we learn in schools, all these things help sort of keep the status quo as they are. And that's one of the reasons why really, you know, we organise as a revolutionary party, because those ideas are the mainstream ideas in society. We have an organisation, Revolutionary Party, that seeks to organise the most conscious workers who are conscious that that is the case, and have different ideas and can fight together to try and change that. And I think that's what, you know, people could do on an individual basis really, is to join a revolutionary party and fight for things together. And, you know, that means fighting where you are. So if you're in a university, it means, you know, we have a newspaper that we organise around, selling the newspaper to your friends, spreading the ideas, organising around you if there's an issue, you know, getting people involved in a struggle here today, so that they get a taste for fighting back, really. And, you know, that's what Socialist Worker Party members do wherever they are, in college, in the pensioners group, in their workplace, or wherever, really. And I'll finish on that. Yeah.